I'll get to introductions in a little bit here. And what I'll be talking to you about is actually something that sort of began a little bit before my sabbatical, but which has really kind of taken new shape over the course of sabbatical. And so as Tony was talking about kind of the new and developing research, I feel like this is very new because it's very much something that we've been working on kind of stage one of, and that we're actually at a point where it would be really great and helpful, and we hope good to get some input and just kind of feedback and questions from people who are doing work with youth. And so we'll definitely have some time during the time that I talk today to do that. So what I'll be talking with you about is something that I'm calling purposeful planning, how to leverage curricular standards to support purpose development in students. And most of my work does right now take place in schools, although the intent of this work is to grow it into a lot of different youth contexts. And so as I talk today, I'll definitely be pointing to some other possibilities and other places where this kind of process might be helpful. All right, so what I'll do is introduce myself. I want to get a little bit of a sense of who's also listening here in our virtual space, and then talk with you a little bit about why myself and one of my student colleagues are doing this work. I'll talk a little bit about what purpose is and this sort of current research that we're doing, but then my hope is really to leave quite a bit of time both in the formal presentation and after for some conversation and discussion. Good ways to do that conversation and discussion would be to utilize the chat function, and I have the people from Pride will also kind of help me keep an eye on that, and then certainly at times where we open it up to discussion, I would love for you to jump in and speak up as well. So, all right, so there are not two of us here talking today, but I did feel like it was important to sort of credit and introduce the PhD student I'm working with as well. So I'll start with myself, and then I'll tell you a little bit about Morgan's role in this project. So as Tony mentioned, I'm an associate professor of education at Texas Christian University in our College of Education here. And I am core faculty with two different centers here. This work was done primarily with an association with our Andrews Institute, which is an institute focused on math and science education. And I'm also core faculty with our Center for Public Education and Community Engagement, which is the center that also works quite a bit with youth development work. And then I also direct our Youth Advocacy and Educational Studies program, which is an undergraduate degree program for our students in the College of Education who are interested in working with and or for in an advocacy role young people, but who want to do it in a different way than a classroom setting. So that's kind of my role here at TCU. And prior to my time at TCU, I was a high school teacher for several years, and I also directed leadership programs at summer camps for several years as well. And there's probably a smattering of other teaching and youth engagement things in there as well, but those are the two big kind of core things I did prior to moving into the kind of work I do now. Morgan Jansing is one of our PhD students here in science education, and she came onto this project to work with me and has really just been such a wonderful voice and contribution to this project. And she really kind of has brought in this great eye of someone who is experienced in a particular field, science education, which is not my actual field, coming and looking at this concept of purpose and sort of helping me think about that and think about where the intersections are. So she is otherwise committed today, but I just want everyone to know that she's a big part of this work as well. So our why, this is a much more, I would say, clear and simply defined why than our why actually probably is. And so as Morgan and I talked about sort of, all right, well, what is it that's really making us want to do this work? We both kept coming back to what we finally called the complex context of teaching in the state of Texas right now. And so most of you on this call, I believe, are in a totally different geographic area. And certainly the sort of complexities of the youth context in Texas are unique and probably very like public in some ways, but I also think that they are different issues that are very real across the geographic regions of our country. And so, and what I mean by that is there's complex political context, complex social context. There are things going on that make it so that practitioners in youth settings are being pulled in a lot of different directions and being influenced by a lot of different things. And sometimes my perspective on that, as I've listened to the people that we work with, is that it can feel like a lot and feel like there are a lot of different voices kind of coming into the work that people are trying to do with youth. And so Morgan came to that, my student colleague came to that, having been a science teacher and kind of thinking about that. I was coming into it more recently as just my role as a university teacher, but also as a parent of a child in our community. And so we started thinking about, well, when we talk to teachers, when we talk to youth practitioners, a lot of times when we'll ask them questions about like, why are you doing this work or what's important or that sort of thing, they'll start getting to some pretty big ideas, some things about like the kinds of citizens they want to be in their communities, the kinds of kind of whole person goals, I would say, where they talk about like social and emotional goals for kids, or they talk about wanting students to feel like they're safe or to feel like they're able to grow and to thrive in the place that they're at. And a lot of times those conversations happen, and then there will also be conversations about whatever their kind of official content that they're responsible for teaching or kind of shaping youth around is. So in our school setting, for the work that we've started this with, that's science, and that's the science curriculum. But you can imagine that might be any number of different things. You can imagine that being the particular content of a sport in a coach's role, where she is teaching about basketball and the different skills required with that and the different kind of teamwork skills that are required to successfully play that sport. You could imagine the content being something like what's needed for a young person to get involved on, say, a youth leadership council for a local government, like what the different procedural things are for that. How do you speak up at a city council meeting? How do you prepare a statement for that? How do you talk across and with difference in those kinds of settings? And so like there's the content of all the things that all of our different practitioners do with youth, whether they're in or out of schools. And then there are often these kind of bigger things that teachers are hoping, or that practitioners are hoping to kind of get at through that content or along with that content. So for me, as someone who has primarily studied purpose in my academic career, I was mainly interested in thinking about how can I help, to start with, teachers integrate supports for this thing we call purpose, which we'll get to in just a moment, as they are also meeting the goals of whatever their learning objectives are in this incredibly kind of complex context that we're in, where a lot of times they're being told in very particular and in sometimes conflicting ways what they can and cannot teach, right? So that in less simple words than what's on the screen starts to get at our why, and more of that may come out as we talk. So Tony Burrow is also in the field of purpose research. And so I realized that as I talk to other researchers, this definition is going to, again, point to one definition that is used in this field, and it's one that I have used as kind of a working definition for a lot of my work, and I'll explain why in a moment. And this is a place where I would love to kind of get a little bit of conversation going as well. So one of the definitions that is used by purpose researchers who are studying the development of youth purpose is that purpose is a stable and generalized intention to accomplish something that is at once meaningful to the self and of consequence to the world beyond the self. That comes from a group of researchers from back in 2003 now, and Damon, Menon, and Bronk, who are all also still doing research in this field. And there are some things about this definition that drew me to using it. So way back when I was teaching high school and I was sort of thinking about moving into doing some research, one of the reasons I wanted to do that was that I was teaching at a school that it was a private Catholic school at that time. And I was teaching in a place where it was very much an explicit part of the education that the education we were giving was for something. And so across every, threshold in the school, across all the doors, any room you entered into, there was a sign that said, enter to learn, leave to serve. And that's a very particular kind of expression of what education might be for. It's not what it's going to be for everywhere. But when I was teaching in that school, I kept thinking, like, we do a lot of interesting things in this particular context that help students both kind of travel their academic path and figure out what they care most about individually and get the skills and training there. But then we're also trying to help them figure out, like, how are you going to use that to impact the world in some kind of positive way? So if your passion is playing the guitar, that's wonderful. And are there ways that can then become the way that you positively influence the world? If your passion is science, and I want to, it doesn't always have to be passion, but if science is the thing that really kind of grabs you and that is interesting to you as a student, how can we as a school help you develop the academic kind of content area skills that you need, while also pointing you to the multiple ways that working in that field might allow you to contribute, right? So for me, as I thought about this fact that, like, I was working in a school that didn't perfectly do that, but that definitely sort of made it an explicit goal. As I came to this definition, I thought, oh, that's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm talking about. When you have this combination of something that is meaningful to the self and also can impact the world beyond the self. And when I'm talking about it, I'm talking about it in terms of positive impact. Right. So one of the things I'd like to do real quick is sort of take a pause, because I realized that as we were doing the introductions of me and my student colleague, I failed to have you put in the chat box what I wanted to know from you. So before we talk more about this idea of purpose, I would love it if in the chat box you could just put like what your context is, like after school, sports, teaching science, like whatever it is. If you could just kind of start throwing those in the chat box so I can get a sense of who's here in this space today. So I see one. Great. Thank you. Lots of 4-H. All right, so I'm seeing, and you can keep putting them there if you haven't already, but this is giving me a good sense. And so I'm seeing a lot of people associated with 4-H, which can sort of, it's an interesting intersection between sort of school and out of school in a lot of different ways. and then some other after school and youth development sorts of contexts, and fewer people who are directly in kind of what I would call more like traditional academic classroom teaching. So one of the things that I think will be interesting as we talk today is for you to be thinking about what is it in my space that at some level I'm sort of expected to be teaching or supporting youth in? And then on the other hand, are there other things that I either know, like I do support youth in doing as I do that kind of official work, or are there other things that I think that official work could really support in some way? And what I mean by that is if I take it back to the science education piece. So as you'll learn in just a moment, in the state of Texas, like most states, we have curricular standards for what is taught at different age levels across the different subject areas. So I could talk to a science teacher here and she might say, this is what I'm responsible for teaching. This is what 6th grade science looks like in the state of Texas. This is what I have to do in my classroom. And she might say, but one of the reasons I really love teaching science is because it is a way to help students, address particular problems in our society or challenges in our society related to the environment or something like that. All right. And so there's that kind of like straight up content level. And then there's this other thing that she might be concerned with or interested in that might not kind of explicitly get stated in those official learning objectives. And I'm guessing that in out of school context, there's a little bit of that going on too, where there is that kind of, this is officially what we're doing. And then this is the kind of other possibility of what might be imparted in this kind of space. So before we move on, I want to stop for a minute to see if anyone has any questions or comments or things that you would like to ask about our why, about the definition of purpose that I've offered, anything so far that's kind of like on your mind before we move into talking a little bit about the kind of process and research that we're doing right now. And I can't see everyone's screen at once. And so I'm trying to get my different things open in case anyone's raising a hand. But you could also put any questions in the chat box. All right, well, I'll let it go for right now. If something shows up, if someone was typing and just didn't get it in there in time, just please let me know, those on the Pride side. All right, let me get that over here. All right, so this is one of those screens that probably, depending on what size of screen you're looking at, is too small for you to read. So I'll say a few things about each of these. But what this is helping you to understand is just kind of the background that's all kind of going into this project, other than that kind of underlying why that I've described already. So again, I've talked about the complex context. So for our particular project, part of that context is the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, which we call the TEKS. So you'll hear me say TEKS. And some of you may be working in Common Core states, but they're very similar sorts of things where they're essentially the list of knowledge and skills that students are supposed to attain at each grade level across different curricular areas. And so that's one thing that was kind of part of our context here, was that the teachers that we're working with in this phase of the project are responsible for teaching these particular TEKS in their classrooms. And then the second bullet point there that says social, cultural, political is it's a very small bullet point for a very kind of broad and complex set of questions. So what I would say is that in the state of Texas right now, as some of you may be aware, and in a way that is happening in a lot of different school districts and school boards across the country right now. There are a lot of different, as I've said, sort of voices and influence about curriculum and about what is taught in schools. And that is particularly showing up in a couple of different content areas. It's particularly showing up in science. It's particularly showing up in social studies here. And I wouldn't really even be able to give you a kind of accurate like state picture, because even in this state, there is a lot of diversity on what that looks like in each different place in this state and different districts and cities and areas of the state. All to say, though, that I think almost anywhere you are working with youth right now, there are a lot of influences about what one should or should not be teaching or talking to young people about. And so I think that that's something that, whether it's the same conversation or same set of issues in any of the different places we work, is sort of one side of things. But I think the other side is that everywhere that people are working with youth, there is often a lot of influence and extra noise, and sometimes really important voice around what it is we're talking to youth about and teaching youth. And so that's part of the context that we're working with here. The other pieces of this background are more kind of from this theoretical side, like what's going into this project. So the purpose in life piece of things, I think it's probably too small on many screens. But one of the things that draws me to studying purpose in life, particularly when I'm thinking about youth in the kind of pre-adolescent through adolescent years, is that it's this really kind of open period of life where there's a lot of opportunity for a lot of growth. There's a lot going on with the brain during that period of time. There is a lot going on in terms of young people are starting to get skill sets that actually, if they have the right opportunities, allow them to sort of interact in very real and concrete ways with their communities. And so that's a really kind of opportunistic part of the adolescent years. The adolescent years are often when students are able to reflect on and articulate some of the own challenges that they and their families may be facing in their communities. And it's not the first time that they've experienced it, certainly, but it's often the time where kind of all of those cognitive and self-awareness skills come together in a way that make it so that adolescents are kind of more able to see, oh, these are some things going on that aren't helping me and my family or my community, and with the right supports that they might be able to say, and I can address them in this way. I can do this in this way. So we know that purpose, when we talk about people having a sense of purpose in life, that tends to correlate with things like well-being, resilience, being a thriving, contributing member of one's community. We also know that when we go back to the definition that I presented to you earlier, most adolescents don't demonstrate all aspects of purpose, and that's not particularly unexpected. And so it's somewhat developmentally appropriate that adolescents wouldn't kind of have it all figured out yet in terms of their big purpose in life. And so, but what we do know is they start sort of getting pieces of it. They start finding that passion. They start exploring ways to contribute. They start being more able to engage in real ways in their communities. And then some, in fact, do actually develop, if we're talking about the definition that I presented earlier, actually kind of develop this more kind of fully realized sense of purpose. The other two things up here really are what have gone into Morgan and I thinking about the process that I want to share with you. So one, I'll admit, is this German actually concept that was introduced to me when I submitted a paper to a European journal, and they said, have you ever looked at this? And I said, no, I haven't. And then I looked at it, and it actually was a really, I felt like a really helpful way of getting at some of the things that that I cared about with purpose in schools and working with youth. And so in the kind of English transition, the way to talk about this is the idea of matter and meaning. And matter is what you would consider in the classroom, the kind of academic subject matter, right? And then meaning is the deeper human truths that get kind of unearthed or revealed in the educational process. And so any of you who have worked with youth, again, probably have had that experience at some point of knowing that there's like something more going on in this youth space than just what it says on paper that I do in this youth space. All right. And so when I taught high school, I taught English, and then I taught world religions and those sorts of things. And there were times where I knew that something more than the novel we were talking about was being talked about in our classroom. I knew that growth beyond being able to identify, traditions of religions across the world was not the only kind of growth that was happening in that classroom. And that meaning part was somehow happening in this kind of interaction between me as the teacher, the students, the subject matter that we are engaged with, that like there was this kind of special synergy going on that was bringing us something more out. All right. So just having that as a concept, that there's these kind of two levels of what might be going on in any kind of youth space, has really been important as we've considered the process that we'll present. And then the other one is directly from the teacher research literature, and it's this idea of teacher sense making. And teacher sense making is the idea of that kind of wrestling for coherence that a teacher might do as they're actually doing the work of saying, okay, in my classroom, the state says I have to do this. The textbook looks like this. In my teacher education program, I learned that you need to do it like this. And there's kind of all of these different influences coming in, and the teacher's the one who actually has to kind of make sense of all of that and make a decision about what he's going to do in the classroom, right? And the other part of that teacher sense-making literature is that it's considered to be a highly social endeavor. So like we do it better when we have other people to do it with. It's really hard sometimes to sit down by oneself and make sense of all of the different things that have been thrown on your plate in terms of curriculum in a classroom. And so it's helpful to have that kind of social experience of doing it. And when I was introduced to this concept, I really was drawn to it as, in some ways, the difficult and the really kind of interesting work of teaching in any kind of context. To take it into the personal for a moment before I describe our process a little bit more. As you all know, we had at least 2 pretty intense years of pandemic living and teaching. And at my university, we were online for about 1.5 years of that process, and then had the option to stay online for a little bit longer. And I taught online for a long time. And as you all know, in that process, depending on kind of where you were working and what work looked like and what your family looked like, I know I was balancing a lot of different things at once. And so my son was 15 months old when March 2020 hit, and I am his parent, and I was teaching my students, and I had my own 2 parents that I was helping to take care of and keep safe as well. And all to say, and all of that, I came through that 2 years fine, and having sort of figured it out, and feeling a little bit kind of burnt out on teaching and figuring things out, because I had spent a lot of time figuring out how to teach and do my work in life in a really new way. the thing that got me inspired again, the thing that kind of got me feeling creative again about teaching was when I had a week that I was able to just sit there with the content and materials for a new course I was going to be teaching. And I just got to like get in there and figure it out and had space to kind of do that mind work again and do that thinking again. And I started talking to some of our teacher education students at the graduate level. So people who are already teaching in the classroom and then also pursuing some other kind of degree. And we started talking a lot about like what was kind of enlivening us again after what had been a little bit of a challenging, not a little bit, perhaps a lot of a challenging couple of years of work. And there were a lot of answers to that question, but one of the answers to that question was definitely sort of having the space and the time to just get creative with what we taught again. And so bringing this teacher sense-making piece into what we're doing now is in part a response to what has started to bring me at the university level and some of my students that I work with who are teaching at the K-12 level kind of into a new period of time in their professional lives, sort of as they emerge from what for many felt like a really challenging teaching context. So now I want to say just a little bit about this process that we're developing, and I am going to share that by talking to you about the initial research that we've done with it. So the research question that we're kind of looking at right now, Morgan and I, is in what ways do the TEKS for middle school science intersect with a developmental and dimensional understanding of purpose in life? And so what we started with was saying, all right, I know one of the things that is going to kind of re-enliven my teaching game is to return to not just the matter, but also the meaning of my classroom teaching. And as I talked to our science ed students, a lot of them said the same thing, like, you know, all right, I got it during, you know, the online teaching. I figured out how to communicate the content I needed to teach, and I took care of kids in social and emotional ways, and I did sort of all of these things. And the thing that's like going to get me kind of like back at it again is really kind of bringing both matter and meaning in. And so the particular meaning that we decided to explore, since it was the research background I had, was this idea of, is purpose in life one of those kind of meaning areas that comes up particularly as one is teaching science? And so for us, we're thinking teaching science, but big picture, we're thinking, can this process be something that people can use across a lot of different content areas? Real briefly, this part of the project was only document analysis, and then I'll say what that is, and then I'll tell you where we're going with it in terms of the process. So for this part of the project, what I did was I gave Morgan, my graduate student, some training in what purpose in life is. She already had the background in science education. She taught science education at the later elementary and middle school level in a K-8 environment. And then we pulled up the TEKS, which I saw that the link is in the chat box for you. We pulled up the TEKS for middle school. And I think the example, I can't remember which example I have linked for you there, but it might be the 7th grade example. So we pulled up the TEKS for science for 5th through 8th grade, right? And after Morgan had gotten this sort of introduction to what this idea of purpose in life is for me, and we had talked a little bit about it, talked about sort of just as a teacher, how she might see that coming into her science teaching, then she went to the TEKS and did coding, where she first just started off saying, having had this conversation about purpose, just where am I seeing places in the TEKS where something about that definition is kind of coming up in my head, all right? And so it was a very open round of coding where she didn't go in saying, okay, I'm going to code for engagement. I'm going to code for encoding, is just sort of putting labels on the data. All right. So like taking a sentence from the TEKS. Let me actually open up. I'm going to go forward a couple of slides because it's easier to show this. So the slide that's on the screen right now is an example of something that we found through Morgan's open coding and then discussions with me along the way. She said, all right, one of the things that comes up in the middle school TEKS is that there are ways in which students, when we're teaching them the content we're supposed to be teaching them in science, we are supposed to be helping them understand what some of these science careers are, right? And so as Morgan looked at that, kind of having this purpose information in her head, she said, oh, well, with just a little bit of extra support and thinking, what those spaces in the TEKS allow us to do are to present possible pathways to life purpose. All right. Now, life purpose doesn't have to be through a career, but it may be through some people or for some people. All right. So this, I don't know if you can post the link for that. I might be able to do this one. Hold on. I'm going to share a link with you real quick. All right, so the link that I just put in there is really just all of the excerpts from the TEKS that Morgan said, oh, when I see that, I see like this is a place in what I'm supposed to be teaching in the sciences where I could also be supporting purpose development. Right. And so the first part of the process that we kind of imagine developing, what we're moving into researching, is that we would have a group of science teachers like Morgan come in and do a workshop where they're able to learn more about purpose, learn more about sort of what the research says about purpose, perhaps think about their own purpose in life and their own purpose in teaching. And then in a second time and space, they come back with whatever their curricular documents are and start looking at them in this way and saying, where are the intersections? Because the thing is that if I, as a purpose researcher, come into the science documents, I don't have that deep knowledge about science education that's going to allow me to kind of see the possibilities in the same way that the science teacher does, right? In teaching something, I have a student, so we are in Texas and we have a large agricultural science degree program at TCU here. And I have in my youth advocacy program an undergrad, he's going to be a senior this coming year, who is doing youth advocacy and educational studies and our agricultural science degree together. And he grew up out on a large working ranch and goes back there frequently to do work with his family. And he and I have had some really interesting conversations where he starts telling me all the ways that he can see purpose sort of having developed in him through his ranch life and through the knowledge and the content that he's developed in that particular area. That's not my background at all. And so I would have never seen some of the possibilities that he was able to see, having both the purpose knowledge and that agricultural science knowledge, right? So our idea with this process is that in this spirit of teacher sense making, we bring in the teacher or practitioner in another space and say, here's an idea of kind of a bigger meaning that might be there in what you teach. Right? And if you have that and go back to whatever it is you teach with that kind of lens, what are the possibilities? Right. So what we found, again, when we did just this kind of mini project with the science TEKS is, again, we found a lot around the kind of pathways to life purpose. And that every single one of the grade level TEKS all the way through has information in there about teaching about different science careers and what scientists do and that sort of thing. And so that was a pretty strong one. We also found that in the sciences in particular, and I kind of had a suspicion this would be there, there's a lot about interdependence in the science TEKS, how systems work together, how, the different parts of a cell are working together within the body, an ecological system more sort of broadly speaking. There's so much in the science TEKS about understanding how each sort of component is somehow playing a role and is playing an important role. And so as Morgan looked at that, she said, in some ways, depending on the age you're working with and the space you have for conversation, by teaching this interdependence that's kind of found in the natural world, there are possibilities for helping students to think about like where they fit in their system and their ecology. And that purpose is one way of thinking about that fit, about thinking about how is it that I specifically can kind of be who I am and what's important to me, but also make that a way in which the community I'm in is stronger and better. All right. And so that was another area that in the sciences, we said, oh, that's a rich possibility there for really kind of building on that idea of interdependence. And again, these QR codes just take you to the excerpts that we found. And then the other area, and these were kind of the three like biggest ones, I would say, or most salient themes that we found. The other one that really kind of stuck out as Morgan was looking at this work were what we ended up calling skills that would support purpose development. So, if someone's really going to kind of figure out how to take something that's important to them and use it in some way to impact the world around them, that's going to take critical thinking skills, problem solving skills, decision making skills, self-regulation skills, all kinds of things that allow you to see a space, identify where you might fit in that space, and then take action to accomplish that. And so in the science TEKS, again, the TEKS are the essential knowledge and skills. Many of those skills are skills that would be transferable into some kind of other environment beyond science as well. And so that was the other place where we thought, well, really, if you're honing in on those skills, you're not just teaching how to be a scientist, you're also teaching how to be a, XYZ in the community with those skills. So in terms of the process that we're wanting to develop, and then I'm going to open it up for questions, we are going to, in the fall, pilot a purpose workshop with our science education graduate students. And so we have a really great cohort of them, many of whom are both in the classroom and working on a master's or a doctoral degree in science education. And so we're going to pilot a workshop that's kind of a part 1, a part 2, and then an ongoing part 3. And the part 1 is much more directed towards those graduate science education students themselves. So they'll come in, they'll learn about purpose, they will have a chance to hear what the research says and think about their own sort of purpose in life and purpose in teaching. And then there'll be some space and they'll be able to come back with curricular materials. And that might be TEKS, it might be lesson plans that they know that they have to teach. It could be any kind of material that they're often responsible for imparting to their students in their classroom. And they'll come back for sort of a part 2 workshop where we really go through those materials and look for the possible intersections between what they've learned about purpose, what they're kind of coming to understand that to be, and the content that they teach. And then they will be able to go back into their classrooms and after that first workshop, and perhaps sort of implement a couple of ideas of how they might kind of lift up some of that meaning as they teach the subject matter of science. All right. And then the part 3, where we actually want this to be pretty much determined by the students who take part, but it'll either be a returning sort of in-person workshop where they come back and talk about things and then go back into their classrooms, or more some kind of like an online community where we can keep sharing ideas and see where it goes from there. And then beyond that, we would love to take it into different areas, other academic curriculum and other youth contexts. So thinking about, again, like in, say, a sports context, like what does it look like for a coach to learn about purpose and then do this kind of thing? What does it look like for someone, again, you know, I know on our city council, we have kind of a youth council piece of it. What does it look like for the individuals who are helping that group of young people to look at this and then go back to their work? So that's the direction that we're going with things. That is all I have in terms of a kind of formal presentation for you. What I would really love is just any comments or questions from anyone, either clarifying or ideas you have, ways you could see this connecting in your own work, or if you want to tell us some big like blind spots in this work, we'd love to hear that too. So I'll just open it up. You can put things in the chat box, or I can kind of keep an eye on the hand raising part of this as well. And we'll go from there. So any questions or comments?
Brandy, while folks may be thinking of a question or typing it into the chat, let me just ask, in your, when you refer to your process of deriving these themes or these potential ways in which people might start engaging and connecting the concept of purpose with the educational matter or the content matter, is your prescription more that those themes that you're detecting are likely to scale? So for example, the intersectionality theme is really interesting. And I could imagine that's relevant across topics, maybe from science, maybe to things like sports. Or do you think that's a process that needs to begin anew within a particular domain, that those themes may not show up across different topics?
Yeah. Well, that's where I think this gets a little bit messy. I, in some ways, started with science because I had a sense that some of that would be there already.
Okay.
I think there's a couple of other academic disciplines where it might be there already. But the other part of this, part of the reason it's hard to say like exactly what, say, part 2 of those workshops will look like, or part 3, is because it is going to be different kind of where it's at for each discipline that we're talking about or area that we're talking about. And it could be that for some, whatever is written down for them or sort of prescribed for them, it's not quite there yet. And it might actually take more sense making on the part of the practitioner to figure out like, what are we maybe missing and how we teach this content, or how we support youth in this way. And I think you could do that in science too. Yeah, so I guess the answer is yeah. In some places, it's probably not already there. In some places, it might be a matter of saying, wow, like when we teach math, wouldn't it be great if we actually did this, you know? And by the way, I do actually think it's already there in a lot of math standards, but that just came to my head as I said it, so.
Okay. Thank you.
Other questions or?
I think your focus on standards is really, I mean, in some ways it's the most obvious thing to focus on, but I think it's also really interesting. I was once on a project where we were proposing an intervention, and our argument was to make the connections between what the intervention taught and the existing standards, right? And I suspect some folks in the audience have tried to make those parallels and arguing for their programming in schools, folks who aren't classroom teachers already. It's so intriguing to hear from a perspective in a different state context, and you've alluded to the kind of the social, cultural, political forces. can you say more about kind of the teaching standards as maybe an inroad to start a different conversation about education, or a different way to think about what matters in classrooms that might be more palatable to folks that don't always agree on what should be happening in classrooms?
Yeah, well, it's such a good question, because I mean, in some ways, I think sometimes if you talk to teachers about like things like the TEKS or their Common Core standards or whatever it might be, like you might get a sort of big collective eye roll too. And so, I get that. On the other hand, it is the document, the policy document, that our legislature has said, this is what you teach in schools. And so I see that as a tool for teachers to say, like, and I mean that in a very honest way, not in sort of an underhanded way, to say, okay, if this is what I'm going to teach, like, what is this really about? Where can I get creative with this? Because the TEKS don't tell you how to teach. They don't tell you what books to use. They don't tell you what lesson to do. They tell you this is the knowledge and skills that we want students to have by the end of a particular class. And so I think in places where there is some kind of like curricular controversy or conflict going on, they can be a place to start that perhaps allows for a little bit more conversation. Having said that, in our state, they're under fire as well, and so it's not sort of a solution to all of those problems, but I think it can be a start when there is a set of standards out there for whatever it is you're teaching, to do some sense making work around that and say, like, what's in there for real that we need to be teaching. And in some ways, like, to flip it a little bit for the subject of purpose. We haven't done this research. I don't know the answer to this question, but one of the things I wonder, like, I'm interested in purpose. Like, I think that should be one of the biggest things that our schools do. That's me, like, putting my cards on the table for you there. And so there are reasons that I believe that. There's some evidence that suggests that's a good thing to have out there for our people and our communities and that sort of thing. And definitely at the end of the day, like, I think that would be a good thing for us to be more intentional about in a lot of different use spaces. At the same time, one of the things I wonder is, if we're teaching science with that purposeful lens, are we teaching science better? And, if we're teaching English with a purposeful lens, are we teaching English better? If we're coaching kids with a purposeful lens, are we doing that coaching better? And so, it's not so much about, like, dare I say, how to like sneak purpose into the curriculum. It's more in doing this and thinking about the ways that they intersect. Are we actually doing the thing we're supposed to be doing better? Are we actually teaching science better? Are we actually teaching ag science better? Like, whatever it might be. So that's how I would answer that.
No, thanks for that. I am curious, like, Pride has hosted a presentation that has a couple through lines with some of the things you're talking about, which probably doesn't surprise you that much knowing Tony's work, but if anyone has an example they want to share of how they see purpose appearing or enhancing their own programming, I'd be curious to share those, because I think this question about, like, is our teaching actually better? Are we teaching the subject matter even better when there's this meaning piece? Is a really important question, and one that I suspect kind of folks have intuitions about in how they approach their own programming.
I'm going to go back to the purpose definition. My screens have gotten a little bit messed up on me here, but I'm going to try to go back to it. There. I mean, the other thing, I think we're pretty close to my time here, but the other thing that I would throw out there that has come up in another professional development about this, I did a similar presentation at the end of the spring semester last year for the group of Fort Worth ISD teachers in social studies. And as we talked about it, one of the things that showed up in the chat box was, I would love to be thinking about this, but I'm tired and I need space to think about like what my own purpose is in this now. And so, and I think that's a really, I was struck by the response and in some ways not really surprised by the response. And I think it's one of the things that we hope to do in that kind of part one workshop is actually like create the space more for practitioners to kind of turn back on themselves for a little bit and connect with that if it's there for them. And I don't know if that's something going on in out of school contexts in the same way or not. But there's this idea that like, if we're going to bring that bigger meaning to whatever we're doing, it's also, it probably has to be there for ourselves as well and accessible to us.
You know, I was going to, on this exact point, I was going to raise a similar sort of question, and I didn't know if it would come across as too much of derailing from the focus of what you're saying, but there just seems to be this sort of meta reflection on this particular definition of purpose, an intention to do something that is meaningful to you, but also as a consequence to others. The act of teaching or mentoring or coaching seems to have some at least surface level components of that. So you kind of wonder, to what extent is it actually activating or engaging or inviting folks to reflect on their own purpose during the process, let alone infusing that in hopes that it inspires a deeper sort of learning among students or teammates or whatever it might be. And I just wonder that. And so this is something I think Pride is starting to think a lot more about. Our interest in youth purpose specifically has sort of led us to realize it's hard to talk with adults who support youth about purpose without making sure that they have opportunities to reflect on that themselves and understand it. And as your training does, formally introduce the concept of purpose to adults who may, when they were young, may never had that opportunity to really think much about it, or even now don't have an opportunity to think about it. So it's hard to do one without the other. So it's interesting that you've arrived there too, realizing that they actually need that space as well.
Well, and I mean, I think it's just at the level of anyone who worked with, you know, young people through the more intense sort of pandemic years that, I mean, I know that when I think about my own work during that time, like I sort of got the job done. It was a time that made it a little bit more difficult to sort of connect sometimes to that bigger stuff, just because there were so many things to do at once, and so many new things, like there was cognitive overload in some ways, you know, and so, you know, again, as we've talked about this, I think that if this is something important to have in the context that someone is working in, I think that a part one is definitely giving the adults in that context space and time to consider it for themselves. Because I mean, really, when you look at that definition, even though it's the one I tend to use, I look at it and I think, okay, that's a lot to ask of anyone, like to, you know, have this big grand intention that they want to accomplish something. It's meaningful to me. It has impact. Like that's a lot. And that takes energy and rest and, you know, I mean, all kinds of things to do that. And so I think just recognizing that that's probably not going to happen from an exhausted place is a big part of what we're trying to understand as we try out different ideas with our teachers and other practitioners here.
Great. That makes total sense. And it's a reminder that in hosting a YDRU, we need to have an adult research update as well, that these things go hand in hand to be sure to make sure everyone's doing okay. Dr. Quinn, I want to take just a moment and say thank you kindly for a wonderful presentation, a lot of insights, and thank you very much for sharing them with us. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me, and please do, I'm sure you've got contact information shared somewhere, but please do reach out. Anyone here, if you're interested in this or just want to talk more about it, I'm happy to.
Wonderful. We do. Thank you
Right.
very much.